he is here. Welcome to this week's Parsha Shir. This week is double Parsha. Interesting piece of trivia is that we will now realign ourselves with the Israelis in their Torah readings, because Israel only celebrates one day of Shavuos, and this year the second day of Shavuot was on Shabbat. They read the next Parsha in line, and we did not. We read the second day of Shavuot reading. And so for the last several weeks, we've been off cycle. They've been one Parsha ahead of us. And now we are back on cycle. Once we read Chukat and Balak in the same week, they just read Balak, but we'll all be together following that. So I decided not to talk about Chukat this year. I actually, what is it that you want? You want this? Having Noam in my lap is funny, because I remember that last year I was very, very pregnant at this time, and I did not put together any kind of source sheet, but we just had like a sicha together, because I had been like hoping I'd be giving birth to Noam by this point in the Parsha reading calendar. So I'm going to share my screen. We spoke a little bit about this last year as part of that sicha, but now we can look at it more in depth. I want to look at the concept, or maybe the liturgical or literary device of mountains in this week's Parsha. Because the story is actually a repeating story, almost like a song with like chapters and verses and chorus, where the king of Moab, Balak, is worried about Israel, about Bnei Israel. They're growing in number, they're getting more secure, they're fighting wars and they're winning. And so he goes on the offensive, not with a military strike, but with some kind of prophetic, a spiritual attack on the people. Hello, she can't hear me yet. And he hires Bilam, and it's very confusing. Hello, Kathy. Very confusing that their names are so similar. But Balak, king of Moab, hires Bilam to put a curse on the people. And last year, I think we looked a little bit at the different ways in which Bilam was uncertain about going down that path, about going to put a curse on Bnei Israel, but finally, talking donkeys and all, he makes it to Balak and the king of Moab, and Balak takes them up to Bamot Baal, right? V'yikach Balak et Bilam v'yalehu Bamot Baal, v'yar misham kitzei ha'am, and there they could see a portion of the people, and Bilam is then supposed to curse the people, but what does he say instead? He says, "Ma ekov lo kabel, uma ezom lo za'am Hashem." How can I damn those whom God has not damned himself, right? He can't seem to get a curse to come out, because he's not just a megaphone, right? He's a prophet, and there's like some integrity to prophecy. And he says, well, God is not telling me to curse them. And you might think that that would be where the story would end, right? Balak would say, well, forget you then, I'll go find someone else to curse the people. But instead, we see a repeat of the story, another cycle of this story. Balak says to him, well, then come to another place, right? Vayomer elav Balak, lecha na iti el makom acher, asher tirenu misham, efes katehu tireh, v'chulo lo tireh. Right? He says, well, let's go to another place. It reminded me of that old Israeli folk song, Mishaneh Makom, Mishaneh Mazal, right? That if you change your place, you might change your luck. And he wants to see if Bilam will be more successful. And he says, well, let's go up to another place, another summit, V'yikachehu Sedeh Sofim, which is some kind of watchtower probably, El Rosh HaPisga, to this place called the summit of Pisgah. And there he builds some altars and he has sacrifices. And then he gets ready. He says, okay, so from here, he says, now you can curse the people. But of course, it doesn't happen yet again. And Rashi asks, why Pisgah? Right? Mishaneh Makom, Mishaneh Mazal. Okay, maybe a different vantage point. But what is it about Pisgah? And do you want to be quiet? And so what Rashi says is, well, actually, Pisgah is going to be a place where bad things happen to Bnei Israel. And Bilam lo haya kosem kevalach, which I think is fascinating. Next year, I want to look only at this together, right? What does it mean that Balaam was not as expert a diviner as Balak? Right? If Balak was his own good kosem, why did he hire Bilam at all? It's sort of an interesting idea that Rashi ascribes to Balak, the king of Moab, a lot of prophetic powers. Right? He says that Ra'a Balak that there was going to be a breach in Israel that would originate from this place of Pisgah. And in fact, if you look to the end of the Torah, and I gave you this pasuk here, we see that that's where Moshe dies. We don't know exactly where Moshe dies for many reasons, but we know that one of them, we know the sort of general location, and that is Rosh HaPisgah. And so it seems like Balak is saying, well, if we go to a place where God knows something bad is going to happen in the future, that might incline God to give Bilam the words to give a proper curse, right? But of course, Bilam sort of talks about the nature of God, right? And at the end of the day, he reaffirms his belief that the role of the prophet is hine varech lakachti uvarech lo velo aspiana, right? That my message was to bless. When God blesses, I cannot reverse it. So even standing in the place where Moshe will die, which might remind God of the sin of Moshe hitting the rock, which we see earlier in our Torah readings this week, he's still not going to do it. He's not going to give a curse. So again, you might think this would be the end, but there's one more try. Balak comes again to Bilam and says, let's go to another place. Right? And it's sort of like, I think it almost feels like one of those funny comedies where, like slapstick comedies, where like you're just going from place to place, hoping that something different will happen when there's no expectation that it will. But here, Bilam has one more trick up his sleeve, as it were. Because where does he go? He goes to Rosh HaPa'or, so the summit of Pa'or. And there, Rashi again jumps in, saying that Kosem Gadol Haya Balak, that Balak was actually a good sorcerer in his own right. And he saw Ra'ashahain Atidin Lilkot al Yedei Pa'or, that there was going to be a punishment on account of Pa'or. V'lo Hayad Yodea Bameh. He doesn't know exactly what the deal is. But he just sees that it's going to be a dark spot. There'll be a dark cloud over that place. And we see from Rashi, right, that although it seems as though Rashi is trying to make a division, Balak is greater than Bilam in his astrology, but astrologers hachozim b'kochavim ro'im ve'enam yodim ma ro'im, that they look, but they don't really know what they're seeing. And so he wasn't able to see what the trouble would be. Moshe, as a great prophet, maybe Moshe could have seen. So from here, I think we've developed sort of one way of thinking about the mountains, right? Which is to say that Balak is trying to exploit his own prophetic knowledge to get Bilam to put a curse on the people, which is an interesting strategy, but it doesn't work, right? Nothing is going to come between God and the people. And that, that's like a powerful statement about God's love for us. I do think there's another interesting variation of that story, right? And of course, the end of that story is that Balak gives the beautiful Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov blessing, which has made it into our own davening. But what is the thing that happens at Pa'or? So it turns out that happens immediately in next week's parsha. Right, Vayeshev Israel Bashitim. Israel is staying at Shittim. V'yachel ha'am liznot el benot Moab. That there's some kind of poor behavior, some kind of sexual profanity that's happening. And when they get with the women of Benot Moab, v'tikra'ena la'am l'zivchei Eloheihan, and then the women invite them to offer sacrifices to their gods. And the people partook of them and worshipped that God. And here we see Israel attaches itself to Baal Pa'or, that very same place, right? Rosh Pa'or, Baal Pa'or, the god of that place, and that our God, the God, was enraged with Bnei Israel. And so I heard a fascinating interpretation of this on Rabbi David Kasher's blog. I often reference his Parsha podcast or blog, written and spoken word. He says, well, maybe this is only two prakim later, or one parak later, right? 24:5-9 sort of wraps up the Balak story, and this terrible mess at Peor starts in chapter 25. And so Rabbi Kasher says maybe it was already happening. Right. While this whole Balak Bilam diversion is happening, Bnei Israel has already started to be with the women of Moab, and they've already started to sacrifice to the god of Peor. And that Balak isn't a Koseim. He isn't someone who you're going to bring this to. Balak isn't a Koseim who is knows something that will happen in the future. He's just an astute observer. He sees what's happening right now, right? He sees that the people are behaving poorly to their God, and he says, "You know what, Bilam? I'm going to show you what bad people they are, and then you'll have no problem cursing them," right? So in this case, he's taking them, it's almost as though, right, like a new teacher is on staff, and he's overlooking all of the minor faults of his classroom because he's trying to suck up to the principal, right? And then all of a sudden, the old teacher says, well, let me show you. And he takes them to the lunchroom, and in the lunchroom, they're having like a massive food fight, right? And he says, well, how could you really stick up for them now? Surely they deserve a curse now, right? And Bilam sticks to it. And so then I think that there's something, the interesting thing, I think, about this change in the reading is to say, in the first reading, it's about a great love between God and the people of Israel. And here it seems like a great mercy between the people and God. God does not spare them punishment. 24,000 people die in next week's parsha as a result of this Baal Peor situation. But God is not going to let Bilam be the one to mete out the punishment. This is a private matter, right, between our own family. And so the mountain of Peor no longer is functioning as some sort of vague bad thing that will happen, but as the site of a current bad thing that is happening. And yet still God is generous and loving to us. So I think that is a nice layer to this story. But I wanted to pivot back to what we were talking about last year, which I don't expect anyone to remember, which is that possibly this whole incident of Bilam and Balak didn't take place in real life. Right now, we've been assuming that the actual king of Moab, who was named Balak, actually hired a guy named Bilam who came to town. But the Gemara in Bava Batra seems to maybe indicate that there's something deeper going on here. The Gemara is interestingly talking about who writes the biblical books, which I think is a fascinating thing to think about in the 21st or 22nd century, where we're taught to say, well, God wrote the whole Torah. Right. It seems like it's not quite as simple as that. Some pieces of the Torah might have been written by other people. So there's a much longer list than I have brought us here. But they asked the question, Umi Katvan, who wrote some of these books, which seem not to have been maybe divinely authored. So the first answer, which I think is probably the safest and most compelling, is Moshe Katav Sifro. Moshe wrote Devarim, right? Devarim are the words of Moshe. Moshe wrote them down. But then they had Parshat Bilam, the Eov. Moshe also wrote the book of the Parsha of Balaam and the book of Eov, the book of Job. And from there stems a tradition that says that how did Moshe write that? Moshe wrote it because he was experiencing those books as a dream. Those were Moshe's I'm so sorry about this very loud touch. Those were Moshe's alter egos speaking. And so let's focus not on Eov, that is maybe a book for another time, right? But if Moshe is Balaam, if Moshe is imagining, he goes to sleep at night and he has a dream that the king of Moab came to him and said, hey, will you curse the people? And think about Moshe. Moshe is like in the thick of it with the people. He's probably quite annoyed at them most of the time. They're always making mistakes. And here is like a chance for him to exercise cursing Bnei Israel. right? It sounds so tantalizing. And yet every time he opens his mouth, he can't do it. Only blessings come out. And they rise higher and higher up these mountains, looking for a place in his dream where he can curse Bnei Israel, but rather getting perspective and realizing who is in charge. God is in charge, right? Exactly what the Lord says, I must say. This is what Balaam says, but we're imagining Moshe says it, right? And here I want to turn to a non-traditional source it's from a book called Adaptive Leadership. This exact text was pulled from an article that was written in the Harvard Business School Review by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And they talk about this idea of getting off the dance floor and going to the balcony. And they're talking about it in leadership capacity, but I think it actually fits very nicely for all people in your own life. And they talk about it as the ability to maintain perspective in the midst of action. Right. And I think that this, like, it could be a parshan on this week's parsha or on this book's parsha, right? This book's content to say any military officer knows the importance of maintaining the capacity for reflection, especially in the fog of war. And I think that describes where Moshe is in his head so well, right? He's constantly running to put out fires of the people. Mistakes that they've made, having to talk God down from killing them all, having to talk the people down from feeling like they want to revolt or they want food or they want meat or right. It's the fog is real. And Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky say great athletes must simultaneously play the game and observe it as a whole. We call this skill getting off the dance floor and going to the balcony, an image that captures the mental activity of stepping back from the action and asking, what's really going on here? And I think that's a hard thing to do. And I think that we can tell that they're getting higher and higher because at first you could only see some people, then you can see more people, but not all the people. And then you can see all the Shvatim. And so I imagine that in Moshe's dream, he's getting to the balcony. He's ascending the mountain so he can see the people in their wholeness, because that will help him take a step back, be reflective, and be more strategic moving forward. Right. And I brought this extra little snippet from later in the article taking a balcony perspective is extremely tough to do when you're fiercely engaged down below, being pushed and pulled by the events and people around you and doing some pushing and pulling of your own. Right. And so I think that maybe the Gemara did not speak in, contemporary organizational speak, but I think that what they're saying is Moshe needed to get on the balcony. And so how did he do that? He had a dream, which he recorded, where he was Bilam. He needed a change in perspective. He needed that physical change in perspective of going higher and higher up the mountain to finally get where he needed to be able to see what was going on below. Because being on the dance floor is actually, it's wonderful, right? You get satisfaction from seeing the people learn the moves and dance in coordination, but it's hot, it's sweaty, it's really loud. And so sometimes you need that change in perspective. And so I would like to argue or to offer that it is neither Balak driving the show nor Bilam. But did you forget I was here? But it's really Moshe in sort of this dream state. And I think there's a lot of proof that we could look at again another day in more detail about the fact that Pa'or is a place in other places in Tanakh around the Yosef dreams, where Yosef has dreams. It like indicates a dream-like state. And the parsha of Balak, that sort of incident of Balak in the larger scheme of things, is actually it's all one paragraph, as though like Moshe wrote his dream journal when he woke up, right? Like the storyline is progressing, then there's this weird break, the story of Balak and Bilam, and then we go right back into the story of Bnei Israel in the desert, as though that had not happened. And so I think that a lot of things in this parsha seem really weird. Talking donkeys, prophets for hire, right? And so it's hard to find like our own personal space there. But I think if we reframe it as Moshe searching for the balcony, getting off the dance floor, that is something that could very much relate to our own lives. Certainly I feel that way, right? It's so easy to forget that the balcony even exists, let alone to use it when you need it. And so to applaud Moshe for taking that time and then being able to come back at this critical moment where he's going to have to beg again for the people to survive the plague that follows the mistakes and the sins at Peor. And so I hope that we all can have the perspective and clarity that we need, that we can take breaks to go to the balcony, whether in our dreams or in real life, and find the perspective to keep going in our own personal missions and in our communal visions, and to do good things in the world. So we have exactly 10 minutes left here. Let me stop the share and stop the recording.